That's where the court twist becomes even more dangerous, because courts don't just examine outcomes, they examine process. And if Harry could demonstrate that he was systematically excluded, misrepresented, or pressured by third parties, it wouldn't just reshape negotiations. It could force the court to question the credibility of everyone involved. That possibility is what triggered the second wave of emergency talks. Quieter, more frantic, and far less ceremonial. This time, the focus wasn't reconciliation, it was damage control. Who had sent what emails? Who had advised which moves? Who could plausibly say they were acting independently? And who couldn't? Sources say Meghan's inner circle began scrambling internally, not outwardly. There were no public statements, no counter-accusations, just silence. The kind of silence that means people are reviewing timelines and checking each other's versions of events. Harry, meanwhile, grew more resolute. He reportedly told one intermediary, "I was willing to be the villain, I'm not willing to let my kids be pawns." That line changed the stakes entirely, because once children are framed as leverage, every move becomes radioactive. The court, sensing escalation, began signaling concern, not through rulings, but through requests. More documentation, more clarification, more explanation around who was advising whom and when. And suddenly, what had been a private separation became a procedural maze where every influence mattered. The inner circle, once shielded by loyalty and proximity, was now exposed to scrutiny they had never anticipated. Who attended which meetings? Who spoke on whose behalf? Who suggested legal action instead of mediation? Harry allegedly claimed that at least one advisor encouraged him to accept the optics of limited access early on, promising it would stabilize the situation, only for those limitations to harden into permanent expectations. He called it a trap, not set by Meghan directly, but by people who claimed to be protecting her. And that distinction is crucial, because Harry notably did not paint Meghan as the mastermind. He painted her as surrounded, influenced, buffered, shielded from dissent by people who filtered reality to maintain control. That framing complicates everything, legally, emotionally, publicly. It suggests a story where responsibility is diffused, where accountability becomes hard to assign, and where the loudest voices weren't the ones living with the consequences. By the time whispers of these accusations began circulating outside legal circles, panic set in. Because once inner circles are implicated, the press doesn't ask what happened. It asks who benefited, and answers to that question are rarely flattering. Harry's team, sensing momentum, pushed for transparency. Not a trial, not a spectacle, but acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that third-party influence had shaped the conflict. Acknowledgement that decisions weren't purely mutual. Acknowledgement that reconciliation had been quietly deprioritized long before the public knew anything was wrong. Meghan's side resisted, not aggressively but firmly. They emphasized autonomy, agency, the right to rely on trusted advisors. But Harry countered with one devastating assertion: advice becomes control when it replaces consent. That sentence spread like wildfire through legal channels, because if courts accept that framing, it forces a deeper question, not just about custody, but about coercive influence. And that's a territory no celebrity case wants to wander into. As the days passed, cracks widened. Friends distanced themselves, statements were delayed. Once loyal figures suddenly became unreachable. The inner circle, once unified, fractured under the weight of exposure. And Meghan? She remained outwardly composed, but insiders say the strain was visible, because the most dangerous part of Harry's accusations wasn't the blame. It was the implication that the truth, once examined closely, wouldn't belong to anyone. It would belong to the record. And records don't care about optics. They care about timelines, intent, patterns. As of now, nothing has been resolved. The court hasn't ruled, custody hasn't been finalized, no official statements have acknowledged the accusations, but the ground has shifted. The story is no longer about a couple drifting apart, it's about who stood between them and why. And if the court decides to keep pulling that thread, this won't end with a settlement. It will end with exposure, because once inner circles become central characters, secrets don't stay contained. They surface, quietly at first, then all at once, and when they do, no amount of silence can put them back. Harry reportedly said, "By the time I understood what was happening, I was already being positioned as the problem." That line landed hard because it reframed everything. Not a husband losing control, a man being managed out of his own life. And when Meghan's side pushed back, calmly, strategically, Harry doubled down. He accused her inner circle of weaponizing vulnerability, of turning private struggles into leverage, of encouraging escalation while publicly preaching peace. He claimed they amplified fear. He claimed they narrowed options. He claimed they profited, emotionally, professionally, strategically, from keeping the conflict alive. At that point, the room split. Not physically, energetically. You could feel it, according to insiders. The moment when neutrality evaporated and everyone realized this wasn't going to be resolved with a carefully worded joint statement. Because now, there was blame. And blame demands evidence. That's where things turned dangerous. Documents were referenced, not produced yet, but mentioned. Emails, meeting summaries, advisory memos that were never meant to be scrutinized outside tight circles. And once those words entered the conversation, the emergency talks took on a new urgency. Not to reconcile, but to contain. Contain the fallout. Contain the narrative. Contain what might surface if the court decided to look closer. Because if Harry's claims gained traction, the story wouldn't be marriage collapse. It would be orchestrated isolation. And that's a scandal no one was prepared to defend publicly. Meghan notably did not respond directly to the accusations in those talks. Instead, her team emphasized process, boundaries, well-being, the need for structure. But Harry wasn't having it. He reportedly said, "Structure without transparency is control." That sentence spread fast, not to the press and not yet, but through the veins of everyone involved, because it summed up the entire conflict in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed or softened. By the time the emergency talks ended, nothing had been resolved. But something irreversible had happened. Lines were drawn, trust was shattered, and the court, now aware of internal fractures, was no longer a passive observer. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the ignition point. Because once accusations turn inward, once inner circles become targets, once the narrative shifts from us versus the world to who's been pulling the strings, the fallout doesn't stay private for long. And Harry, he wasn't done talking. When the emergency talks ended, nobody left relieved. They left rattled because the real damage hadn't happened in the room. It happened in what came after. Doors closed, calls were made, loyalties were tested in real time. Because once Harry blamed Meghan's inner circle, the quiet understanding that had kept everyone civil evaporated. Advisors who had once moved invisibly suddenly became liabilities. Friends who had always been described as support systems were now being examined like possible accomplices. And every decision from the past 2 years started looking less like coincidence and more like choreography. What terrified both sides wasn't just what Harry said, it was how prepared he sounded. This wasn't a rant. This wasn't a breakdown. This was a man who had finally connected dots. According to insiders, Harry began referencing moments that had never made sense to him before. Sudden shifts in tone, strategic leaks disguised as organic chatter, advice that always seemed to push him further away from reconciliation and closer to permanent separation. He allegedly said, "Every time I tried to slow things down, someone else sped them up." That's when the phrase managed conflict entered the conversation, not as an accusation, as a realization. Harry claimed that emotional volatility had been quietly encouraged, not calmed, that escalation had been framed as strength, that compromise had been portrayed as weakness, and that anyone who questioned the strategy was labeled unsupportive, unsafe, or secretly aligned with the other side. In his version of events, the marriage didn't just fall apart, it was steered into collapse by people who stood to benefit from a permanent rift. And once that theory took hold, the implications were explosive because if the inner circle had influence over messaging, access, timing, and legal posture, then custody conversations weren't just about parenting, they were about power. Harry reportedly expressed fear, real fear, that decisions involving the children were being filtered through people whose priorities had nothing to do with family and everything to do with leverage. He claimed he'd been presented with finished decisions, not invited into discussions, plans already outlined, lawyers already consulted, narratives already tested quietly in friendly media circles. And when he resisted? He says resistance was interpreted as instability. The courtroom didn't explode with shouting. It froze, and that silence was louder than any scream, because this wasn't just another ugly rumor. This was the moment the story snapped in half and revealed what had been rotting underneath all along. This was supposed to be routine, a quiet, procedural turn, paperwork, lawyers nodding, the kind of thing that never leaks. But something went wrong, catastrophically wrong, and within minutes, phones were vibrating, aides were whispering, and emergency calls were bouncing between continents like live grenades with the pins already pulled. Because a new court twist had landed without warning, and it forced emergency talks nobody had prepared for. Not Meghan's team, not palace intermediaries, not even Harry himself, until he did the unthinkable. He pointed inward, not at the monarchy, not at the press, not even directly at Meghan. He blamed her inner circle. And once that accusation was whispered behind closed doors, the entire narrative shifted from messy separation to something far darker. A war over influence, control, and who had really been steering the wheel while the cameras were pointed elsewhere. Let's rewind. For weeks, the public story had been carefully manicured. Smiles that looked rehearsed, appearances that felt staggered just enough to spark chatter but not panic, statements that said everything and nothing at the same time, the illusion of distance without confirmation, silence framed as dignity. But behind that silence, something had been moving fast, too fast, a sealed filing, an unexpected jurisdictional challenge, a clause that wasn't supposed to be activated unless things were already beyond repair. And when that clause surfaced, it triggered what insiders are now calling an emergency convergence. Lawyers, fixers, advisors, and intermediaries scrambling to stop a chain reaction that no PR strategy could contain. Because this wasn't about divorce anymore. This was about who had been whispering in Meghan's ear, who had been drafting strategy while Harry spiraled, and who, according to him, had turned a private breakdown into a public siege. Harry didn't walk into those emergency talks calm. He walked in volatile. People in the room say he looked exhausted in that dangerous way. The way someone looks when they've already replayed every argument in their head 1,000 times and finally decided to burn the script entirely. And when the discussion turned to guidance and advisement and third-party influence, Harry snapped. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with surgical precision. He said, "This didn't start with us. This started with the people around her who never wanted this marriage to survive." That sentence detonated everything, because suddenly the conversation wasn't about custody, logistics, or separation boundaries. It was about manipulation, gatekeeping, and the possibility that Meghan hadn't been acting alone, that a carefully curated inner circle had been shaping decisions, controlling access, filtering information, and escalating conflict while presenting themselves as protectors. Harry, according to multiple accounts, claimed he had been cut out of key conversations long before the public noticed anything was wrong. Messages delayed, meetings rescheduled, concerns reframed as paranoia, doubts dismissed as instability. And the most chilling part? He said he didn't realize it was happening until it was too late. Until positions hardened, lawyers stepped in, and suddenly every disagreement came with legal language attached. That's when the new court twist hit. A procedural move so quiet it almost slipped through unnoticed, almost. A request for accelerated review tied to parental decision-making authority. Not a ruling, not a judgment, a signal. A signal that the court was no longer convinced the situation was stable enough to continue drifting. And when that signal landed, emergency talks were no longer optional. They were mandatory. Phones lit up in California, messages flew to London. Intermediaries who hadn't spoken in months suddenly found themselves on the same encrypted threads. Because once courts start asking questions, narratives collapse. Harry, sources say, arrived at those talks with one goal: to get the truth on record. Not for the public, not for sympathy, for survival. He allegedly laid out a timeline that rattled everyone in the room. Moments when he claims decisions were made without his knowledge, when legal pathways were discussed before marital ones, when strategies were tested quietly to see how much resistance they'd meet. And every time he traced those decisions back, they didn't lead to Meghan directly. They led to the people around her. Advisors who handled everything, friends who knew what was best, consultants who framed conflict as empowerment and separation as liberation.